I was walking down the hallway this week, and there's a book cart out in front of the library. You can also return books that you borrow from the library, but every once in a while, I'll just slip a 20 into the little slot in the book cart and figure that then, because it's $1 a book, that I can just take whatever I want, and if the library, comes out ahead, that's okay. And this was the book that I picked up. It's by Martin Buber, and it's titled "Israel and the World: Essays in a Time of Crisis." And it was first published in 1948, so the essays and lectures that he gives are happening earlier from that. And I gained comfort and trouble the fact that this book exists, right? Because it means that even before the state of Israel existed, there was enough to give lectures and essays about the Jewish people and Israel in a time of crisis. So I found comfort because the time that we're in now is not the first time the Jewish people have been in a moment of crisis. So I found comfort in that. After all, Ecclesiastes says there's nothing new under the sun. And so maybe this time of introspection, of turmoil that so many of us are feeling is just on that cycle. But on the other hand, when is this going to stop? Like the fact that we again are in another time of crisis, even if this passes, it means that there will be another one down the road. And the specifics of each is different. The specifics of each encounter that the Jewish people have with people that don't like us, or empires that don't like us, or nations that don't like us, or ideologies or cultures that don't like us, is unique to each one. But there seems to be a trend. And so I was both comforted and disturbed by it. So many of us have been feeling vulnerable on this 92nd day of the war. And we've been feeling vulnerable in a way that was very different than 95 days ago. The good old days where just people marched through Charlottesville. I would take that back again compared to what we are facing now. With the rise of anti-Semitism in our schools, our universities, the cultural hate that is being directed at Jews. Now, the response has been that I've talked to many people. One person said, even though I don't keep kosher, I'm starting to wear a kippah at work and out. I said, even when you eat the cheeseburger? He didn't quite give me an answer, but a point of Jewish pride. He was wearing his kippah for the first time out in public as a response to feeling vulnerable. The response was to be proud. Or another person just this week said that she was going through her jewelry box at home and found the Star of David. I see the one that you're wearing, right? That you're wearing the Star of David, and she hadn't worn it since her teenage years, and it was a time to start wearing it again as a response to feeling vulnerable. And others have told me about taking off their mezuzah from their doorposts because they were worried about what might happen to them. The greatest moments of anxiety is fear that someone would come and attack them, just like the kibbutzim were attacked as well. So, essays in a time of crisis. I have some texts here that we're going to look through. If you don't have one yourself, hopefully you're sitting next to someone and you can share. So Martin Buber, he titled this lecture, "The Jew in the World." It was a lecture he gave in Germany in 1934. So let's remember what was happening in 1934 in Germany. In January of that year, the Jews were banned from labor unions, which pretty much meant that you couldn't work in any national activity or government agency and many other areas of work. In August of that year, the president of Germany died, and Hitler named himself as the Führer of it. And then, of course, it was 1935 when the Nuremberg race laws were passed, just to kind of give us a sense of what is he talking about, what is the context that he's talking about when he gives this lecture in 1934. And it resonates with me, this idea of being vulnerable. The concept of the Jew in the world in its most serious sense did not rise until a certain quite definite juncture. This juncture did not, as one might suppose, coincide with the destruction of the Jewish state by Titus. Right? The destruction of the temple would be an obvious date to give. But he says, but with the collapse of the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was a few years later, the temple's destroyed in 70 of the Common Era. This is in the 130s of the Common Era, is the date that he says that this sense of vulnerability came to a head. When Jerusalem ceased to be a Jewish city, when the Jew was no longer permitted to be at home in his country, it was then that he was hurled into the abyss of the world. The Jews were just sent adrift out into the world. And ever since, he says, the Jewish people, has represented to the world the insecure man. My bolding here to emphasize, within that general insecurity which marks human existence as a whole, there has since that time lived a species of man to whom destiny has denied even the small share of dubious security other beings possess. The Jewish people haven't had a sense of security that many other people have. Whether or not it is aware of it, this people is always living on ground that may at any moment give way beneath its feet. Every symbiosis it enters upon is treacherous. Every alliance in its history contains an invisible termination clause. Every union with other civilizations is informed with a secret divisive force. It is this inescapable state of insecurity which we have in mind when we designate the Jewish diaspora as galut, as exile. So this insecurity and vulnerability that we have today is not new. It is renewed, though, in our time, as people are actively working to undermine the state of Israel's right to exist. As people are actively not promoting Palestinian rights and a state, but undermining Israel's right to exist. And so these words spoken in 34, I get what he's talking about. That sending people adrift, and that while the Jewish community may have stability in America or in Israel, do we really? It doesn't take much or to scratch deep to see that maybe Buber's words continue to resonate. Now, vulnerability goes both ways. I think that's important to recognize. Right? We see it in this week's Parsha, this sense of vulnerability even by people that are secure. Let's look at how Pharaoh expresses himself. Right? An unexpected analog. And so in Exodus, an earlier part of the Torah that we read today, but in this week's Parsha, but the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly so that the land was filled with them. And a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground. So what is Pharaoh's emotions as expressed in the Torah? Fear. Right? This is Pharaoh. He is the most powerful human quasi-deity in the world, And he is feeling fear of this very small people, this very small group. Chizkuni, a biblical commentator, I think expands on this in an interesting way. He says our sages in Tractate Sota, in the section of the Talmud, state that there were 3 advisors of Pharaoh who were discussing how to preempt a savior of the Israelites who would take them out of the land. Recall that a people who came to Egypt only about 100 years previously numbered only 12 families, yet meanwhile multiplied, not assimilated, and had come to be viewed as an existential threat to the original Egyptians. The Israelites were known to have a powerful God. The Israelites were known to have a powerful God, and the Egyptians had studied the traditions of that people. Chizkuni is picking up both that by now the Israelites are seen as a people, as a group, as a connection, having cohesion with each other that was separate from Egyptian society. I'm taken by this idea that Buber understands why Jews feel vulnerable, but maybe we can have some insight into why the Egyptians also felt vulnerable at this time. Right? So we have this clash of two narratives of vulnerability. One trying to charge over the other. The Egyptians trying to kill the Israelites through the plagues and through the drowning of the firstborn, right? In its most extreme. We have the narrative of vulnerability of the Egyptians trying to kill the Israelites. And we have this constant feeling of vulnerability of the Jewish people as expressed by Buber and felt even to this day. Now, Israel was supposed to be the answer to vulnerability. Right? Israel, in a world of Buber, in the world of Hitler, in the world of being thrown out of nations, right? Israel was supposed to be the answer to give security to the Jewish people. But much earlier, in 1882, a book is written, or a pamphlet was written called Auto-Emancipation. And it was just signed by a Russian Jew, but we know Leon Pinsker was the author. And he also is addressing the same issue. The hoary problem subsumed under the Jewish question today. What is the Jewish question? Where are we supposed to be? How are we supposed to be integrated into the countries where we are? They don't want us. So the question, both from the nations and from the Jewish people, is how can we be secure? Where can we plant roots that are actually stable? Subsumed under the Jewish question today, as ever in the past, provokes discussion. He writes, like the squaring of the circle, it remains unsolved, but unlike it, continues to be the ever-burning question of the day. That is because the problem is not one of mere theoretical interests. It renews and revives in everyday life and presses ever more urgently for solutions, as it did in 1882, and I think it does in 2024. This is the kernel of the problem. As we see it, the Jews comprise a distinctive element among the nations under which they dwell, and as such can neither assimilate nor be readily digested by any nation. Hence, the solution lies in finding a means of so readjusting this exclusive element to the family of nations that the basis of the Jewish question will be permanently removed, right? That it will be solved, right? That the nations of the world, the United Nations, seems to be constantly berating the state of Israel, one of its own members, and undermining its right to exist. So in 1882, Pinsker knew that no one really wanted to give security to the Jewish people, and that continues to be today. This does not mean, of course, that we must think of waiting for the age of universal harmony. We would call it the Messiah, some glorious age. No previous civilization has ever been able to achieve it, nor can we even in the remote distance, that day of the Messiah, when national barriers will no longer exist and all mankind will live in brotherhood and concord, right? That is beautiful and it hasn't happened in his time or in our time yet. We can't wait until then. Until then, the nations must narrow their aspirations to achieve a tolerable modus vivendi, an arrangement that's acceptable, right? That we have to not wait, but we have to find a peaceful coexistence. The world has yet long to wait for eternal peace. Meanwhile, nations live side by side in a state of relative peace, secured by treaties and international law, but based chiefly on the fundamental equality between people, not the sense of mutual vulnerability, but of equality between people. But it is different with the people of Israel. There is no such equality in the nations dealing with the Jews. The basis is absent upon which treaties and international law may be applied. Mutual respect. Only when the basis is established, when the equality of Jews with other nations becomes a fact, can the Jewish problem be considered solved. And we have not reached it. The war that is going on is against Hamas, and Hamas is very clear on what its goals are. It is to destroy the state of Israel and as many Jews around the world as possible. People like to think that they'll soften. I don't know why. The atrocities that they have committed are directly connected to the goals that they state. So we should believe them on what they want. And we need to mutually understand the vulnerabilities that the Palestinian people equally feel. So it's not one narrative dominating the other and disrespecting or disregarding the other side. That the vulnerability of the Jewish people and of Israel is real. And it is not new to this time, as I've shown you through these historical texts. And equally, the vulnerability of the Palestinian people is also true. And I invite and encourage and implore the Arab countries to equally get involved in a productive way to solve this problem so that the vulnerabilities will be addressed and security and mutual respect will be held. Because at this time of friction, there is war, and war by definition is bad. And war by definition is necessary. It's so easy in this moment of vulnerability to be overwhelmed, to feel like you want to step back, to feel that you want to take the easiest TikTok solution and to take that as fact, when the reality is so much more complicated. And so, like I implored Sam, I ask of us to keep our eyes and our ears and our hearts open to what is going on. Our hearts are large enough to be lovers of Israel and for our hearts to be broken simultaneously. I want to close with a poem. Again, just like the Buber book, I found a book that is called After the First Rain, Israeli Poems on War and Peace. War and peace are no strangers to Israel. So Yehudit Kafri is still actively writing today. I don't know the date of this poem in particular, but it is a poem of what I believe is hope. Sometime there will be a great love, like the love of rain, erasing frontiers, growing in all the ears of corn of the Middle East. Sometime, long before the end of days, we shall beat into peace all words of hate and war. Shabbat Shalom.